my name's Dave Adams, and I love playing games. At the 2015 PAX convention, one of my favourite game designers, Mike Selinker, presented his list of top 100 games you must absolutely, positively know how to play. The 100th game on the list was a challenge to play a game of my own design. With a desire to understand more about the hobby that I love so much, I've taken on that challenge to design a game. But first, I need to learn as much as I can about game design. I'm going to start by playing as many of the games on Mike's list as possible. Join me as I learn more about the core mechanic.
Hi, I'm Dave Adams and welcome to the Core Mechanic. Today we're doing another tech talk, and by we I mean me, as in I, singular, not plural, as in when Ricky was here. In fact, Ricky is but a distant memory. Ricky has gone to the beyond. Ricky was called away, sadly, rather suddenly, to a job somewhere else in Sydney. And did he think of me when he left? No! He just left. Just walked away from what we had created together in those very few episodes that we had, but we did them together. So now I'm doing tech talk on my own, which is... Actually, I'm doing all of it on my own. But we still have each other. I promise not to leave, and if I do leave, I promise to take the camera with me. So, you know, we'll still have each other. However, I did always feel that I should have my own segment where I can just sit down and talk and drink coffee. Of course, drinking coffee on camera looks really bad, so I probably won't. Now today I want to look at the word conceit. And conceit has to do with, it's sort of got connections to motif and to theme and also to IP, which isn't just a statement of fact, it is actually an acronym for intellectual property. To give you an example, let's look at one game. Welcome to the Dungeon. Now this game should be pretty obvious what this game's about. And that is essentially what the conceit is. So we know that this is a dungeon crawl. We can expect the information that that conceit gives us is that firstly, we're probably going to be taking on monsters. There's probably going to be treasure. We're probably going to be some sort of fantasy character. Other information it might give us is to do with how to actually play the game. So when I turn over the cards, so the game has cards, when I turn over the cards and I see a dragon, I probably know that the dragon is going to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest character. And it's probably stronger than the other cards, which might be Golem, Skeleton Warrior, and Goblin. And in fact, even just saying those names, you've probably got an idea of how strong each one is in comparison to each other, if you're a fantasy person. Now, if you have no connection with fantasy, then maybe that's harder to ascertain. However, that conceit of being a dungeon crawl gives us a lot of information about the game, but also what to expect in the game. Another good example of how a conceit might differ is Sushi Go and Sushi Dice, two very different games, both of which are about making sushi. So in Sushi Go, you're collecting different cards to try and create sets, which all are different sushi types. So you want your, I'd love to say the names, except they're all the Japanese names, and I know I'm going to get them wrong. However, you set down all your different cards, and at the end you score up based on what sets you've collected, or should I say what sushi sets you've collected. Now, Sushi Dice, however, and you can hear the bell, it's excellent. That bell rings throughout lunch times whenever kids are playing this game very loudly. Sushi Dice is, you're still collecting sushi, you're still making sushi, but you're rolling dice and you're trying to roll the correct combination to get the card in the center. So neither of these games' mechanics are compatible. Like they're not the same at all. They're completely different game mechanics, but the conceit is the same. And what it does then is it gives people something to connect to. So I know I'm putting together a sushi dish. But there are games without a conceit, and they tend to be abstract games. One example here would be the game No Thanks. No Thanks has no conceit. You're essentially just playing cards, trying to collect numbers. Another game with no conceit could be Uno. Uno has no conceit. However, and here's the difference, Uno might not have a conceit because it's an abstract game, but in my collection I've got Spider-Man Uno, and as I play each card I'm fighting villains or I'm swinging through New York or whatever. Now suddenly I have a conceit. Suddenly there's that theme and motif coming through, and that all becomes part of it. Now where this translates over is when we start to get games like Elder Sign, all part of the Lovecraft universe. This is an IP, this is intellectual property. So here's a game that has taken the property of someone else, so in this case it's an author, and it's taken their writings, the writings of all of the Elder Sign novels, the Lovecraftian novels, I guess, and it puts them into a board game. The problem with intellectual property is that it's restricted, it tends to restrict your design or your game down to the fan base, people who love the property already. Because you start with an intellectual property, you start with some sort of story, and you've got to try and think of game mechanics that make it fit. The benefit of starting without intellectual property is that you get to develop the game, and the conceit and the mechanics and all that can work in conjunction with each other and can develop and grow together. Oftentimes you get these sorts of games, intellectual property games, which are really generally highly criticized by fans for not really representing the intellectual property, and by non-fans for not really being an interesting game. Now, generally, the best sort of intellectual property to get is ones from movies or books, because they come with a narrative already, and working in a narrative base is already good. So a conceit tries to ground a game or give some sort of connection for the player to a reality, almost a motivation for doing what they're doing. And intellectual property, which is taken from the works of someone else and applied to it, does the same thing, and it helps frame it in a universe. The benefits is that usually people who love that universe or particular IP will take to that, and they will understand, they'll have that information naturally. The downside is that it does tend to only attract the fan base. They're very highly, a lot of times people are critical of those games. Abstract games, however, don't have a conceit, so there's no real connection for the player to the outside world, to what's going on. What that means for them is that it might be harder to work out the rules, it might be harder to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Most game designers, from the works that I've read so far, have suggested that abstract should be the last resort. That when you can't really work it in with a theme, motif, a conceit, or an IP, to go abstract then. My only problem with that is that there are a lot of people out there who really like abstract games, and in fact they're the only ones that they play. Now, naturally, it's not for me. I'm not actually a big abstract game player. I do like No Thanks, I do like Uno on occasion. I get a bit bored with that. For me, I do love the story. Story and narrative become a huge part of my gaming experience. Not only do I want to engage in a story, I want to feel part of that story, and I want a story to take away with me. Now, a conceit can eventually become its own intellectual property, and a good example of that is perhaps World of Warcraft, which was a generic fantasy style game, but over time it's become so fashioned, and the world's expanded so much that the story's become a part of it, that the World of Warcraft is now its own IP. So it was a game that had this fantasy genre conceit, and now it's its own intellectual property. Now, in his book, Characteristics of Games, Garfield suggests that there are levels of conceit, starting right at the start with very much abstract games which have no conceit, then games which have just a theme, like Bejeweled, which is you're collecting jewels, and that's a theme, but that's not really connected to the outside world. However, then he talks about chess as having a very light conceit, which in chess you're supposed to be simulating warlike battle tactics. And then it moves through to, and he suggests that the further you go through and the further you go on, the closer you get to full-on simulation games. And generally what happens with simulation games is you have more and more rules, it becomes far more complicated, and the tactics and the understanding the game and being able to grok the game is much harder. So what I'll do is I'll post a link or some sort of reference to that book, to the book down the bottom, and you can check out that list yourself. I might even try and post the list with a description of where you can find that for yourself. It's a very useful list if you're trying to understand this topic. When you think about it in terms of as learners, one of the things as a teacher, I try to connect the kids with prior learning. In some senses, I feel the conceit is a bit like that. By having a conceit, people are able to enter into a game with their prior learning. They're able to activate that prior learning and go, oh, I understand things about this game already. I'm not starting completely as a blank slate. If it's a fantasy conceit, then I have certain expectations or certain knowledge which will be useful for me in playing the game. It gives me that advantage so that I'm not completely out of my water. When the rules are completely disconnected, I can actually link them into elements of story or elements of mythos that I already have there within my prior knowledge. I hope that's been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I hope you can now take that language and adopt it into your own game design discussion, and I'd love to hear from you below. Thanks for watching. I'm Dave Adams. This is the Core Mechanic doing some tech talk. We'll see you next time.